Hello, good morning. It is so good to see y'all today. Hi, I'm Melissa. It is so good to be here at the Wiley Church. Last week, Justin and I visited the Arlington Church, and it's such a good community over there, but as we were driving, I was like, can we just turn around and go back to Wiley? I missed them already. But then we visited Arlington, and they are so fantastic over there. It's a small and vibrant community. They're like meeting in this tiny room in a rec center, and it's at that size where like you notice everybody and you can actually still know everybody's names. That's one of the things about this body. I'm like, oh, we're slightly too big for me to know everybody's names, but I want to. And in Arlington, you can. So anyway, our friends in Arlington send their greetings. It was good to get to visit them. And that they still have an open invite if any of y'all just want to go see how the Arlington community is doing. They meet, again, tiny little rec center room, so we can't like overwhelm them with all of us visiting at one time. But if you're interested in that, then talk to one of us who can give you all the deets. So we are continuing our sermon series on Mark, and there's been these repeated themes. So James started out our series and asked these questions like, what does the gospel according to Mark, what does that tell us about who is Jesus? And then how do we respond to Jesus? And then a couple of weeks ago, Austin Gage visited us and shared some of these themes about how Jesus is more than we think, and Jesus has different priorities than we do. And then he highlighted the way that Jesus is a storyteller. Jesus doesn't just give us like, here's a moral command and you must follow it. But he paints pictures, he gives us stories, and relates to us through that. And last week, William spoke and added some of the questions. What does it cost to follow Jesus? And what might we not be willing to sacrifice to follow Jesus? And so I thought that's a big, hefty bank of questions, and if all of us just kept adding 2 or 3 questions every sermon series, by the end of the series, we'd have this much of the sermon just being those questions. So I thought I won't add to them, but I'm going to repeat them again so that you can keep an ear out for how these themes keep popping up. So those questions again were, who is Jesus? How do we respond to Jesus? In what ways is Jesus bigger than we think? How are his priorities different from ours? What's the cost of following Jesus? And what are we holding on to that gets in the way of following Jesus? So I'll be, in theory, covering Mark 7 and 8 today, but I'm actually going to spend most of my time talking about the first story there in Mark 7. So we get this scene of the Pharisees and their beliefs about what's clean and what's unclean. And I'm going to paraphrase the first part of it, but this whole section, this passage is packed with these like powerful truths about God's nature and then how people often respond to God. So there's this scene, there's these teachers of the law who are all gathered around Jesus. And they noticed that Jesus' disciples weren't observing the same hand-washing rituals that the teachers of the law expected. And it wasn't just about like literally dirty hands. There was a moral and spiritual meaning associated with it. So the Pharisees had taken the temple commands that were to the Israelites and basically kept expanding it. They were adding these human traditions because they saw God's law and they were concerned, okay, if we cross that barrier, we'll be sinning. So they created additional barriers. They basically moved the fence posts because they didn't want to transgress God's law. But over time, people just lost the point. They lost the plot. And they started following these traditions, and it turned into its own subculture. And it turned into a display that they were the people who took God's command seriously. But the disciples of Jesus weren't the ones who felt the need to follow those rituals. And the Pharisees were salty about it. And then Jesus defended his disciples. And so he was speaking to the Pharisees, and he said, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. And then he goes on and says, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. And that one, imagine how painful that was to hear. Like, that is such a big, just like, oof, stabs you in the heart. Imagine God saying that to you. you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. So I was listening to a podcast about this particular passage. It was an N.T. Wright podcast, and one thing he was very clear about: the Pharisees viewed themselves as people who were trying to honor God. And we should be careful not to just paint this in like one-dimensional caricature of like, oh, Pharisees were just like self-righteous, full of themselves. Like, some of the Pharisees, some of this particular sect, seemed to genuinely want to learn from Jesus. Like, they would go and sit at his feet. Some of them were combative, and some of them were just like trying to understand, who is this teacher? And there's this story in Luke about how some of the Pharisees come to Jesus and warn him, hey, Herod is plotting against you. Get out of this town. Go be safe. Like, some of these teachers of the law seem to be genuinely concerned that Jesus not get executed at that point. And some seemed more interested in their own power, their own status, than actual truth. And so there's, again, a lot of nuance to this group that we collectively know as the Pharisees. But we should be careful not to just dismiss the Pharisees, because this line between us and the Pharisees is sometimes smaller or blurrier than any of us are really comfortable thinking about. We should be careful not to look at them and just say, I thank God that I am not like those Pharisees. Instead, these rebukes against them are often rebukes against us, and warnings about how easy it is to slip into those patterns. And so I had to imagine myself in the Pharisees' shoes, or their sandals. And then I realized one of the ways I relate is like I pretty much only want to wear sandals. But I think about like how much of my life is structured around trying to serve God, and how much of my friend group and my community is structured around spending time with people who have the same commitments, same values, all of those things, and trying to spend time with God's people. And then even as I was thinking about the examples that I share here, I'm like, am I secretly doing like a humble brag of like, if I share these sacrifices I've made to serve God, am I actually just bragging? Or am I giving an example so I'm relatable? But I think about things like various points in career choices, things that I decided not to pursue because it would take me away from my community, away from my church family. And I think that's a sacrifice I made, and years down the road, like, I'm so glad I made that choice because I get to be in a community like this. But there's other things like Justin and I bought a house here in Wiley because we wanted to be close to our church family, even though I think like my dream house would be within walking distance of a light rail station. And I'm pretty sure that's Justin's dream house too. Actually, I think Justin's dream house is an airplane, but in any case, yeah, Wiley is not the top of our list of like nice town we would like to live in, but the top of our list for nice town to live in is where God has planted us and in the community God has planted us. And I can't think of a better place to live than that. And then sometimes I think about, what if we just, instead of giving money to the church and to campus missionaries, we just kept it for ourselves? What things could we do with that? But no, we make that sacrifice. And then I imagine myself in the Pharisee sandals and think, what if Jesus is standing in front of me and says, you honor me with your lips, but your heart is far from me. Your church events are just parties for entertainment, and your comfortable house isn't a place of community, but just a way of drawing attention to yourself. I would be crushed, you know? Like, after a few gallons of tears, I hope that I would accept that rebuke with humility. And I wonder what that looks like for each of us, like which are the things that we do because we want to honor God, but then we just got so focused on, I'm doing this thing. I'm doing this small group, not as a way of honoring God, but because that's just what people do. And so I pray that each of us examines in humility and prayer these things that we're doing and ask, am I truly honoring God with my heart, or is this an empty offering? Am I just making these rituals to look good in front of other religious folks? One of these themes that we see in the character of Christ is that Jesus is about people-keeping, not rule-keeping. That his priorities are radically different from ours. That Jesus' priority is, how does this honor people made in God's image? And there was this theme throughout Mark, throughout the book, of this confrontation with the religious powers. So earlier on, we saw this a few chapters ago when the disciples were snacking on some grain on the Sabbath. And then Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And so they had these commands, like the Sabbath was a gift to people to say, get some rest. You don't have to work all the time. And then people became focused on the rule of how dare you work on the Sabbath, instead of saying, hey, it's a gift, rest. And so this was at the end of chapter 2, start of chapter 3, so a few weeks back. But I wanted to revisit that theme because, again, it keeps in mind with the hand washing issue. And so I wanted to highlight, in particular, I've been reading through this Tim Keller book, so shout out to Kristen for letting me borrow it. But it's Jesus the King, and it's basically going through the book of Mark, but how the book of Mark highlights, oh, there's Kristen. It's like, you were over there earlier, and so I try to motion in that direction. But highlights how Jesus reveals himself through the gospel. And so when he's talking about that theme of people being more interested in religious ritual than in relationship with God, he picks up that theme and then relates it to some of our modern cultural divides. And it was one of those evergreen things, still relevant, seems to be a constant problem in our society, even though this book was written quite a few years ago. But I'm going to read out this section. So he's mainly talking about the Sabbath encounter. At the end of this Sabbath encounter with the religious leaders, Mark records a remarkable sentence that sums up one of the main themes of the New Testament. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. The Herodians were supporters of Herod, the nastiest of the corrupt kings who ruled Israel, representing the Roman occupying power and its political system. In any country that the Romans conquered, they set up rulers. And wherever the Romans went, they brought along the culture of Greece. Greek philosophy, the Greek approach to sex and the body, the Greek approach to truth. Conquered societies like Israel felt assaulted by these immoral, cosmopolitan, pagan values. In these countries, there were cultural resistance movements, and in Israel, that was the Pharisees. They put all their emphasis on living by the teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures and putting up big hedges around themselves to prevent contamination by the pagans. See what was going on? The Herodians were moving with the times, while the Pharisees upheld traditional virtues. The Pharisees believed their society was being overwhelmed with pluralism and paganism, and they were calling for a return to traditional moral values. These two groups had been longtime enemies of each other, but now they agree. They have to get rid of Jesus. These two groups were not used to cooperating, but now they do. In fact, the Pharisees, the religious people, take the lead in doing so. That's why I say this sentence hints at one of the main themes of the New Testament. The gospel of Jesus Christ is an offense to both religion and irreligion. It can't be co-opted by either moralism or relativism. The traditional values approach is an approach to life that is moral conformity, an approach taken by the Pharisees. It's that you must lead a very, very good life. The progressive approach, embodied in the Herodians, is self-discovery. You have to decide what is right or wrong for you. And according to the Bible, both of these are ways of being your own Savior and Lord. Both are hostile to the message of Jesus Christ. So he's highlighting this cultural divide that we see, both in biblical times and in present day. That there's currents of essentially reactionary traditionalism, and there's currents of unprogressive or uncritical progressivism, of just try everything new or try everything old. And they are both hostile to the way of the cross. Both are enemies of Jesus. A life in submission to Jesus leads to both of these cultural extremes pushing back on us and perhaps creating alliances against Christians. And so it pushes us to ask, am I finding myself a little too comfortable in either of those groups? Or is this one of these ways that, again, I'm setting aside the commands of God in order to observe our own traditions? And there's all kinds of ways that this shows up. There's these times that we think that we're honoring God's sexual ethic, but then we drive away people who are created in God's image. Or we think that we're trying to bring God's kingdom to earth, and we're trying to craft a society that displays the right amount of economic justice, and we forget that sin will still corrupt everything we do. Sometimes our good deeds just become empty rituals that never lead to heart-level change. And we have our acts of service and giving to the poor, and then we still hope that they never live next door to us. Sometimes we think we're fighting God's holy wars, and we try to make laws that match our morals, and then we create a generation of people who are, again, empty, not a heart-level, committed follower of Christ, and turn other people against us, thinking that Christians are just self-righteous hypocrites. And then sometimes we try to escape, retreat into our little bubbles. We hope that we're just not going to be corrupted by the sin of the world, while the reality is sin is in our hearts. And no matter how much we restrict our exposure to our fallen culture, no matter how much we say we will only read Christian books and watch Christian movies and listen to Christian music, we're still sinners. We're still fallen people in need of a savior. And instead, we've just created a little subculture that doesn't connect with those who truly need God's love. But all of these patterns have a powerful magnetism to them. And these tribes, these subcultures that we create, it's people around us telling us, oh, you're part of the right crowd now. And this is really one of these costs of following Christ. This is a real social cost that we endure, because we have to learn how to rest in the acceptance of Christ alone and be content with that, and not in some little group, subculture, tribe that tells us that, oh, if you're a good enough ally, you're one of the good people. If you're a good enough homeschooler, you're one of the good people. I guess, is this the homeschool section? Yeah, pretty much. As a recovering homeschooler, I'm speaking to my people. We have these idols of thinking, oh, if I'm a good enough worker, if my bosses approve of me, or if my coworkers approve of me, if my career is good enough, if I'm either woke enough or politically incorrect enough, will be accepted on Twitter or Parler, as the case may be. I don't know what audience I thought that reference was for. Yeah. But I mean, I have noticed this battle in myself. Like when I start asking, again, which tribes am I trying to seek approval of? And so there's been something going on I've really been wrestling with for the past several months to a year or so, and just trying to work through, like, what is my attitude towards this? How do I show love in this situation? And I'm finding that in some circles, I can't even tell them, hey, I'm going through this like hard emotional, spiritual, intellectual struggle. I can't even tell them, because the response would be, you need to accept uncritically, and anything short is to be a bigot. And then there's other people in Christian bubbles that aren't safe to talk to you about, because to even have a question or to even ask is a rejection of Christian tradition. And I should just get on board with unquestioning acceptance of that. And I see those extremes again. Reactionary traditionalism or uncritical progressivism, or whatever it may look like. And I found that as I've been thinking through this, to my shame, too often, I found that my priority is, well, what will people around me think? Especially people in my church. Instead of thinking, my number one priority is honoring God. That so quickly we replace God with godly community, and it turns into its own form of idolatry. And in my wickedness, I can turn something as good as pastoral advice into an idol. So again, please don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying don't ask for godly advice. That is not what I'm saying. I look at what Paul writes. Paul writes, follow me as I follow Christ. We're not disciples of Paul, we're disciples of Christ. And so we look to people in our communities and ask, how have you worked through it? How have you followed Christ in this situation? And then we follow the Spirit and we follow God's truth. Paul asks in Galatians 1, am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. Unsurprisingly, the disciples still don't get it. In verse 17, it says, after Jesus had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this. Are you so dull? He asked. To which I say, yes, I am. Are you so dull? He asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart but into their stomach and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. And I think the editorial comment there is kind of interesting. because you don't see these editorial comments very often. But Mark makes a point of saying, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Which again, there's so much going on there. He's reinforcing what Peter experienced in Acts 10 and 11. And that's showing that it's consistent with who Jesus is. Like, we don't have to follow the Israelite rituals and the foods to avoid, and which rituals and festivals and all of that. But Jesus highlights that, like, the sin, the problems are in our hearts. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft and murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. That's about a 4-month series of sermons just on that verse, right? Like, all these ways that these things just creep into our hearts. But it's our sinful nature that's separating us from God. And it's through walking humbly with God that we're healed. Again, not these religious rituals, not being like conspicuously avoiding consumption of the world. It's not that. It's our relationship with God. And again, this passage begs serious time in prayer and conversations in community. Because some of these sins we're like, yeah, obviously don't murder. But a lot of these are just like culturally acceptable sins. Deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly just seem to be baked into like, oh, that's just who we are. We act like, oh, young people will just go through a phase of being teenage idiots. It's like, well, no, I think folly is still sinful, according to Jesus. So maybe we shouldn't treat that as normal. Or envy, slander, arrogance. Half of these are just like baked into like our political culture or how we talk about politics. And we just act like, oh, that's just what that field demands. Instead of saying, no, maybe we should act like Christians even in that regard. So I'm not going to spend 4 months on that. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on one of the more puzzling stories in this passage. And so this is the story in Mark 7, 24 through 30. So Jesus is going out of one of the areas, going to the Gentile areas. He wanted to get away from the crowds, but he couldn't keep a secret. And so this woman comes to him and asks for healing. Well, healing for her daughter. So I'll read it out. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. So if you're anything like me, your first response might be some righteous anger. How dare he compare her to a dog? And then you might have some theological confusion. Why is Jesus being like exclusive and discriminatory here? And those are the reasons I couldn't just like skip over this section and be like, oh yeah, just read it at home, you'll be fine. It's just like, this is one of these sections that just like vexes me. And in the Tim Keller book, he points out that this story is one of the rare times that people, upon hearing Jesus, accepted Jesus' frame of reference. Like so often when people come to Jesus, they've got their agenda, what they're interested in. They ask Jesus a question, they don't understand the answer, and they're just confused. But in this case, Jesus gives an answer and shifts the frame of reference, and she responds within that language. So she's, instead of like asserting her rights and saying, I'm a person, not a dog, she's like, yeah, I might be a dog, but even dogs get crumbs. Like she gets on board with the agenda that Jesus shows here. So instead of asserting her perceived rights, or at least what we would perceive as her rights, she accepts what he says and then appeals to God's good nature. So she says, yeah, you're right, Lord, I don't deserve it, but your goodness is so vast and you are so merciful that there's going to be some of this love and mercy that spills out. This story also illustrates that God's ways are not our ways. His order of doing things, like, I don't understand at all. I don't understand why God chose to reveal first to the Israelites and ask them to mediate and then reveal to the world, but that's what Jesus did. And so I don't have to understand that. And this woman was okay with that. Again, she got into Jesus' frame of reference. This story also reminds us that God is the good Father who hears our prayers. And this is one of these topics, again, I struggle a lot with the thought of prayer, like, doesn't God know what I truly need? Why would I ask God for something if God knows what's best for me? So why would I ask? But again, consistently throughout Scripture, we see that Jesus encourages people, ask boldly, to pray. And he gives that example in the garden, like he prays that the Father takes this cup from him. And then he says, but not my will, but yours. And again, that's where I've got another just like whole ball of like, God, I don't understand, but I trust that you are good. Questions like, I don't understand that. But I see that example. I see that I pray boldly and then submit myself to the Father's will. And in this case, this woman asked boldly and God answered. And she's affirmed for her bold request. So from here, I'm going to skip most of the other stories for the sake of time. But again, the speed summary, and I hope you all are reading Mark on your own time. But a lot of these stories here are healings and feeding the crowds, and they're continuing to show that Jesus has immeasurably more power than we understand, that he has power over creation. And as you read through those stories, sometimes people figure it out and realize, oh, this is the God of Abraham, and other people continue to be clueless. And again, repeatedly, he's telling people, don't talk about it yet. It's not time yet. And some of them listen to God's timing and some don't. But the last piece I wanted to talk about today is kind of like summing up a lot of these questions of how should we respond to Jesus? How do we respond to Jesus? And then the costs of following him. So if we skip to the end of Mark 8, we have one of these calls to discipleship, starting in verse 34. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So this looks like, what does it mean to like pick up our cross and follow Jesus? It is all like what's happening in your life. What part of yourself do you need to be sacrificing for God? And this is one of these thoughts that is like, a lot of this is very much a personal application question, right? Like, I can't give a sermon that says like, here's the one thing in everybody's life. Because that's something that you're working out with the Spirit that God's revealing to you as you walk with God. And instead of just saying, go home and pray, I wanted to make sure that we left some time during the service today for you to spend a few minutes of just prayer and reflection and journaling. And so I've got a few of the questions that we've been going throughout this sermon today. Are there things in your life that the Spirit's been telling you, like, this is the part of your life that you need to be laying at the cross? Be sure to spend some time in prayer and journal about that. Or this question of like, whose approval? Who am I making an idol of? Whose approval have I been seeking instead of God's approval? That's something that, again, like lay that at the cross and ask, how do I get myself back onto God's agenda, not just on my own? And then this thought of what's keeping me. It's like sometimes I know what is it that I need to sacrifice, but it's so easy. Like it's so easy to just seek the approval of a person standing in front of you instead of spending time in Scripture and praying and journaling. And so part of what it would cost me is just time, priorities, and being willing to seek God fully in that. So we're going to spend a few minutes just, with your own notes, notepad, spend a few minutes of quiet prayer, reflection, journaling. And then after a few minutes, we'll have another song and communion together. So, makes sense?